Amanda, can you hear us? Okay, cool. um, so please just type your name in the chat if you would like to speak. You can also type your questions or comments into the chat box, and we will be reading and responding to those throughout the meeting. Please make sure that you send your messages to everyone so that they do not get missed. If you have any technical difficulties, you can contact the ADWR Help Desk, and their contact information is on this slide. And lastly, this meeting and the chat will be recorded. We have been using questionnaires to provide an additional opportunity for stakeholder input. On the screen, you can see the link for the questionnaire for today's meeting, and Maggie will also be putting that link in the chat. All questions are optional, so you can choose what you would like to provide input on. If you would like to complete the questionnaire, please submit it by December 1st. And if it's after December 1st, you can still provide feedback by just emailing us at managementplans@azwater.gov. All right, and then I will hand it back to you, Natalie.
Great, thank you, McKenna. So as I said, this is a meeting of the 5th Management Plans Municipal Subgroup. Thank you all for being here. My name is Natalie Mast. I am the AMA Director responsible for the management plans. You heard from McKenna just now. McKenna is going to be doing some of the presentation today. That's McKenna Welsh. Amanda Long is running kind of the background of the webinar today, and Maggie Martin will be helping out with some of the comments in the chat box today. So we definitely have a whole team effort that makes these things run smoothly, and we hope to have a good productive meeting today and hear a lot of feedback and questions and comments from you all. So thank you all for being here. Thank you. So on the agenda today, it has been a little while since our last meeting, so we did want to provide just a little bit of a recap of our previous meetings. But then we also wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the discussion of the GPCD program and what that program might look like for the 5th management plans. So I think that'll be a really interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing thoughts and ideas from all of you. So could we go to the next slide, please? So with that, I will actually hand it back to McKenna to walk through some of that recap. Yeah, McKenna.
Okay, great. Thanks, Natalie. So I will be providing a brief recap of our last municipal subgroup meeting. In the last meeting, we went through the non-per capita conservation program proposals, which included tier structure, points requirements per tier, BMP category requirements, and the addition of a new planning category. We received positive feedback on these proposals. However, stakeholders requested to see draft language for the new planning category BMPs. We drafted those BMPs, and I will go over where to find those in a moment. In the last meeting, we also introduced the GPCD program and requested feedback from stakeholders on how we could improve this conservation program. At this point, we have not received a lot of interest in alternative conservation programs, but later in this meeting, we will briefly discuss an idea that will be presented at the next subgroup meeting, which is planned for February 10th at 10 a.m. So as I mentioned, stakeholders requested that the proposed planning category BMPs be drafted in order to provide more specific feedback. These BMPs were drafted and added to the draft Appendix 5C, which is available on the ADWR website on the 5MP concepts page. The link to the draft Appendix 5C questionnaire is on the slide, and Maggie will also be providing that link in the chat. We are asking to submit this by December 31st, so we can wrap up the additional changes and any input that we receive into that Appendix 5C and those BMPs. Okay, so next we will be moving on to the GPCD program. So in the previous municipal subgroup meeting, we asked stakeholders how the GPCD program could be improved. The responses' main themes included breaking down GPCD into residential and non-residential, simplifying the calculations for the GPCD requirement, and basing the calculations off of more recent data and current water efficiency technology. We've also heard that some of the assumptions used to calculate the GPCD requirements are outdated, which has resulted in some providers having GPCD requirements that are unattainable. We will discuss this feedback in more depth throughout this meeting. So to recap the GPCD program, it is a conservation program that is limited to large designated providers. There is a formula that includes a default, minimum, and maximum GPCD, which is used to set the GPCD requirement for each provider. The program has been relatively static over time, and the statutory language is vague. The statute says that the GPCD program shall require reasonable reductions in per capita use, and because the requirements in the statute are vague, the framework for this program is flexible. So next I will be going over some of the initial GPCD data. This dashboard is available on our website, so you can take a better look at the data, and the link to the webpage is on this slide, which is our 5MP concepts page, is where you can find this under the municipal dropdown and then under the GPCD dropdown. So I'm going to open up this dashboard so you can have a better look at the data. Okay, so the top graph shows the lowest GPCD, the average GPCD that a provider has had between the years 2009 and 2018. And then it also shows the fourth management plan GPCD requirements. And then the bottom graph shows 5-year averages for residential and non-residential GPCD for each provider. So looking at the top graph, you can see that some of the lowest GPCDs and average GPCDs are much higher than the fourth management plan GPCD requirement. And you can see that with this first provider C, provider N, provider O. And so this pink color here is the fourth management plan requirements. And the blue teal color is the lowest GPCD that a provider had between the years of 2009 and 2018. And then the black color is the average GPCD between those years. And I will just flip through some of the AMAs to show that this same concept is happening in multiple AMAs. You can see here, provider 4, the total GPCD requirement for the fourth management plan is much lower than the average or the lowest. And in Tucson, we see this as well. There are some providers that just haven't been close to their fourth management plan requirement. So this is showing us that we need to base the requirement off of more recent data to have requirements that are more realistic and achievable, which is in line with the stakeholder input that we've received. The bottom graph, we wanted just to show that there hasn't been any dramatic changes in residential or non-residential use. So you can see that in most cases, the GPCD has decreased for both residential and non-residential over those 5-year periods. And otherwise, they stay relatively close to each other. So the reason we wanted to bring this up is because the fifth management plans, we are focusing on improving from where we currently are. So this is the emphasis that we are using. It will be an emphasis on conservation that is realistic, but still moving in the right direction. And from this data, we can see that the previous requirements might have not been realistic for all providers and did not match what the provider was historically achieving. So I wanted to pause here to see if anyone has any questions or any suggestions for other data that we could be looking at or other analysis that would be helpful for developing this program.
Thanks, McKenna. I do have a question here from Sam. They're commenting, how are the residential and non-residential GPCDs calculated?
The same way that the total GPCD is calculated, we just split out all of the commercial uses from the residential uses, and then still divided that by the population and the days.
Right. So just to add to that, this is Natalie. Just to add to that a little bit, there is on the annual report forms different categories for residential and non-residential water uses or deliveries. We understand that there may be some inconsistencies in that data from provider to provider, but that's kind of the best available data source that we have at this time.
Thank you, Natalie. Question here from Jennifer. Do I understand correctly that because many providers did not meet the goal, you are going to reduce the requirements to make them more realistic, thus less conservation?
So I think what we're looking at is assessing for the fifth management plans, and we'll get to this a little bit later in the meeting. I think what we'll look at is assessing whether those targets were ever realistic. And I wouldn't necessarily frame it as less conservation, because those providers for whom the GPCD program is not realistic would just go into a different program. They move into the non per capita program because that is a program that they can comply with. However, if we were to set targets that are achievable for those providers would then have an incentive to work to reduce their total demands to try to meet these GPCDs. I think making those targets more reasonable, realistic, achievable will actually drive increased conservation from where we are right now. And that was kind of McKenna's point a minute ago, that we're kind of basing this on where we are right now, trying to improve our current situation, moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Natalie. I have a comment here from Sam. She'd like to be unmuted. Amanda?
Sam, I've gone ahead and unmuted you.
Thank you. Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. I just wanted to bring up a point about having these GPCD numbers, especially when we can see that the total requirement is, in some cases, half of the actual GPCD. It doesn't look good. And I think that it's fair to point out that GPCD is calculated differently across the nation, and especially between the different basin states. And I think it would be important to include language when we're sharing these numbers, that it's important to note that there's not an industry standard for how GPCD is calculated, and it's not indicative of what a typical resident uses per day. These calculations are used for a regulatory purpose, and from my research, I haven't found another state that regulates based on GPCD. These numbers could be taken out of context, and I don't think that that's fair or tells a story.
Sure, and I think that's part of the reason that there were some requests to split it by residential and non-residential to get a little closer to that household type use, where a lot of people kind of quote those types of numbers or expect the numbers to reflect a household or residential type use. So I definitely, point well taken, Sam. We'll make sure on the website to add kind of a footnote to the dashboard with some definitions, I think. So.
Thank you, Natalie. And McKenna, I have a couple of questions and comments coming through. Comment here from Adria. They've commented, but if we create more realistic goals, that means less providers in the non-per capita program, which is the only program that provides data in terms of conservation. I agree that we need to relook at GPCD calculations, but I'm concerned that if we move people out of a BMP-based program, when that is the only way we currently collect additional conservation data.
So I guess maybe I'm not totally clear on what you mean by additional conservation data there, Adria, and feel free to unmute yourself if it would be easier to answer any questions here. I think what we would be leaning toward is trying to make sure that all of our programs are realistic and achievable. I think the number of providers in one program versus another, I don't know that that's necessarily going to swing terribly wildly, because the GPCD program is limited to large designated providers. I think we'll still have a significant number of providers in the non-per capita program, and we'll still be getting that additional BMP type data. And maybe you can clarify your question if I didn't quite get a response to that.
Thanks, Natalie. Sam has commented, thank you. I have a couple of other participants that have mentioned that they agree with Sam. And a couple of questions here from Patrick. He's commented, on the non-residential GPCD calculation in this dashboard, did you use Schedule F1 Part 2 to pull out non-residential water use? If so, do these numbers only include potable deliveries?
McKenna, maybe you can chime in here, or I'm not sure if Kyle or Caitlin are on the call and could help out with this question. I believe that's where that data came from. The information on that particular schedule, I believe, would be total water use rather than potable only, but there may be, maybe there's someone else that can correct me there. So what these numbers reflect is, at least for the non-residential part, would be total deliveries. And that may be a source of some of the difference there, but it's not going to drive the significant differences you can see on this chart. I'm not sure if Kyle or Caitlin might want to chime in if they're here.
Yeah, I worked with Kyle and Colette to run a query for this data. So I could, if they're here and they know, they can answer. If not, I can definitely get back to you on what that data included.
We'll definitely follow up and confirm the precise items that were included in that data.
Kyle, I've gone unmuted you.
Thanks, Amanda. So the query would have all the raw data, potable and non-potable. It just depends how it was compiled for the analysis itself, which I'm not totally sure of.
Thank you, Kyle. Okay. Maggie, did we have any other questions?
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, question here from Tina. She's commented, based on your response to Jennifer's question, I have a follow-up question. Is the goal then to drive providers off of the non-per capita program? The latter seems to be more rigorous of a program since it requires programs that can demonstrate water savings.
I wouldn't necessarily frame it as driving anyone out of or into either program. Rather, we kind of are recognizing that there may have been some flaws in the way the targets were, or the requirements were established for the most recent GPCD program. That's something we have heard from multiple stakeholders. So what we want to make sure of is that if people are able to be regulated under the GPCD program, that it's a realistic program and an achievable program for them.
Thanks, Natalie. Comment here from Chris. They've mentioned that they agree with Sam. GPCD is not a standard calculation industry-wide, and some context is needed when using it as a regulatory requirement. Comment here from Adria. They've mentioned that I know we have worked hard to build pre and post water savings into the BMP, so that is the only hard data we have to know whether or not audits, rebates, educational programs, etc., are saving water. I agree with need to make them more realistic. I think we are in agreement, just looking at it in different ways. Thank you for clarifying. He agrees with Tina.
Thanks. Thank you to Adria. I appreciate that comment and that clarification. I think you're right that we're kind of saying the same thing, maybe just in slightly different ways. And to your point about the data regarding kind of those individual conservation measures, I do think that even with improvements in the GPCD program, that we would still have enough providers in the non-per capita program to still be able to analyze that type of data. But so definitely point well taken. But I think that both programs can kind of work together toward the same types of conservation goals.
Thank you, Natalie. Question here from Emily. She's commented, I'm new to these meetings, so apologies if this has been addressed. Is there any idea that accounts for certain providers being closer to the standard than others?
So it'll be something that we maybe talk a little bit more specifically about later in this meeting. There are different ways that the requirements have been set in the past that may not necessarily be reflective of the actual makeup of a city. Additionally, there are big differences between cities in terms of the ratio between their residential and non-residential demands and other characteristics in the city that might drive some of these differences. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in this meeting. Maybe if we don't address your question more directly later, you can chime back in and help me clarify that a little bit.
Thank you, Natalie. Comment here from Sam. She's commented, gallons per capita per day is neither an accurate way to quantify non-residential water use, nor is it an appropriate means to regulate non-residential water users. Additionally, having a residential GPCD and a non-residential GPCD creates space for a problematic comparison. Gretchen has commented that she agrees with Sam.
Okay. Thank you for that comment, Sam. I appreciate it. I think, and again, I keep pointing to later in this presentation, I think perhaps we'll kind of get to that. So historically, this program has been a total GPCD program. There was a non-residential component that was calculated, but I think perhaps that's something we can have a discussion about either in the context of this program, how we treat the non-residential portions of demands, or in the context of some kind of alternative program. whether there's some alternative program that we might develop that might split those things out a little bit more formally. Yeah, so Maggie, did we have any more questions? I think I saw one more come in.
Thanks, Natalie. Yes, comments here from Heather. She's noted, it is really important to understand that especially when residential and non-residential GPCD is not separated, GPCD numbers can be poorly representative when a provider has one large user come into their area. This lacks a balance of recognizing the economic value that those large users may bring who may still be efficient. We don't want to set water conservation goals up to be counter to economic development goals, but rather make them complementary. Non-residential BMPs seem to be a good balance here as they focus on equivalency over total water use.
Great, thank you for that, Heather. So maybe if there aren't any other comments or questions specifically on the data here, maybe we'll move on and kind of, I really appreciate the direction these are going, the questions, but perhaps we move on into the next section because I think these comments, I keep pointing to later in the presentation because I think these comments are really getting at what we wanted to talk about today. So I think we can kind of, maybe I'll provide a little bit more background and then we'll come back to some of these comments. So thank you. I think that was from Heather. Thank you, Heather. And maybe let's come back to that. I think that's a good discussion to have. So thank you. So we did want to take some time to talk about how are those GPCD requirements set, both in previous management plans and going forward into the 5th management plans. So if we could go to the next slide here. We had heard previously that exactly what several of you commented, breaking things out by residential or non-residential or other types of components might be a really helpful thing to do for the 5th management plans. I think we've already seen that repeated here in the comments. So I think that's an interesting direction for this to potentially go, and that's why we included that type of a breakdown on that dashboard that McKenna showed. Another option for moving forward would just be to do total GPCD without components, but also obviously with some clarification or some footnote around how different cities aren't necessarily going to be comparable to each other. That's something that we've kind of maintained this entire time, that just because one city's GPCD is higher than another, that's not necessarily a value judgment between those two cities. It just might mean that they have different characteristics, which is why each city gets its own requirements, why there's not a standard requirement across the board, because there are different characteristics across the different providers. I keep saying cities, and I should say providers, excuse me. Yeah, so we have a number of different options. There have been different approaches to this in previous management plans, and it's definitely something that we should consider and talk more about kind of throughout this process and as we're thinking about the 5th management plans. If we could move to the next slide, please. So for the 4th management plans, there were a couple things that we heard created some difficulty or created some unrealistic requirements for some providers. One of those things is that the non-residential component creating these targets was just carried forward from the 3rd management plans. That wasn't recalculated under the 4th management plans. We know that some of the providers had significant non-residential growth in that kind of intervening time period. So we want to make sure that updating, at the bare minimum, updating those non-residential components, updating those kind of historical values was a really important thing. Something we think was smart and worked well for the 4th management plans was kind of the structure of the way the requirements were set. there was, and I understand that the language in the plan can be a little bit confusing, so we have this slide to kind of help summarize it a little bit. Ultimately, though, the way that requirements were set for the fourth management plans is that there was a default value and that value was bounded. So that default value had a minimum and that default value had a maximum. So what we could consider doing for the fifth management plans is using that same type of framework, but possibly calculating each of those values differently. So in the fourth management plans, the default value was a median from a historic period, a set historic period. The minimum was a theoretical value based on an assumed residential use plus a non-residential component from the third management plan. We recognize particularly that the minimums would need to be updated or calculated differently. And then the maximum was the final GPCD requirement that was seen in the previous management plan. And perhaps there were some difficulties with the way that previous management plan requirement was calculated, or some misunderstanding or some changes in the makeup of that provider since the third management plan. So again, we're just kind of carrying those things forward in this structure. However, for the fifth management plan, we could change some of those formulas. So I think the structure of having a default with some boundaries on it is smart, having a minimum and a maximum on that default. But I think it's worth having some discussion about, okay, if we're going to do that type of structure, are we splitting out components and setting different requirements for the two components? Are we doing a total GPCD? What are our formulas for kind of each of those line items? So if we could go to the next slide, it might help to kind of show what we mean here. So this is where we want to think about how do we actually go about setting those GPCD requirements for the fifth management plans. And this is where I think we can come back to some of that previous conversation, where I think we want to hear some more of your specific thoughts around this. What you see on this slide, I just want to be very clear. These are really just initial thoughts here. This, I would not even go so far as to call this a proposal at this point. So take that for what it is. We definitely want to have some additional conversations, both with individual providers and with this group, before we establish any kind of a proposal for moving forward with the GPCD program. So some initial thoughts that we had here, kind of both internally and with conversations with some providers, something that we came up with was this idea of the default being a 10-year median or average, but have that being a rolling average over time. So as the provider is improving, they might be that rolling average is going to improve over time and is going to kind of naturally tighten over time. So that allows for both a realistic target to be set and allows for reductions over time. So it's kind of a both things type of solution. There might be additional ways to consider the minimum or the maximums. How do we set those previous maximums? There are ways that those were done in the fourth management plans, in the third management plans, and perhaps we move away from those previous methods. Perhaps it's this kind of rolling average strategy. We talked about using the lowest actual achieved GPCD from the previous 10 years as a minimum. I think there might be a lot of brainstorming that could occur around how we establish each of these items in order to kind of establish that default with boundaries on it to make this program both more realistic and more effective by making it more realistic. So I will go ahead and pause here. I would love to hear from all of you if you have any thoughts, initial gut reactions to this kind of a framework here.
Thank you, Natalie. Comment here from Patrick. He's commented that the non-residential component from the third management plan was also carried forward from the 1990 second management plan. We appreciate that ADWR recognizes this component to be outdated.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. And I do think that this idea of some kind of a rolling average related to the targets might be one way that we can avoid those things becoming outdated in the future.
No additional questions or comments yet.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and pause for just 1 minute here, just to allow people some time to type into the chat box. I know we don't have a timer on the screen, but I'll look at my clock on my phone, and we'll allow people a little bit of time to write into the chat box.
I do have a question here from Terry Sue. She's commented, would you consider a 5-year rolling average?
Sure. So as I kind of mentioned, pretty much anything on this screen is is up for debate. These were very much we wanted to have we wanted to have a starting place for the discussion. So we wanted to put something on the screen. These were very much just kind of our initial stabs at, okay, if these are the problems we've heard, how might we go about addressing it? So absolutely, the kind of time frame that might be used for rolling averages is absolutely something that we can discuss. The actual criteria that we're using in any of these is something we're looking for suggestions and discussion on. Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Terry Sue.
Thanks, Natalie. A couple of questions here from Kathy. She's commented, do any of these consider temperature and precipitation? Hotter temps and lack of monsoon could have resulted in higher water consumption. Did water providers see a change?
Thank you, Kathy. So they don't directly incorporate considerations of temperature and precipitation. However, some kind of a rolling average would kind of naturally incorporate that. We do see higher demands kind of across the board in very hot and dry years. But so using that kind of rolling average would allow for those higher demands to kind of naturally be incorporated into the requirements, if that makes sense. I don't think there needs to be an additional component to add those in because it would be reflected in the historical use data. One other thing that we will talk about in a subsequent slide is there is also in the existing program a flexibility provision, a flex account. So that's also something we will want to discuss as a part of this group, as a part of this discussion of the GPCD program. What do we do with the GPCD or the flexibility provision? Do we leave it as is? Do we adjust it? How do we move forward with that? I think it's pretty clear that some type of flexibility provision is really helpful in these types of programs. So I think we'll keep having a flexibility provision, but we should have a discussion of what exactly that looks like if that just gets carried forward from the fourth management plan forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Comment here from Brett. He's commented, thank you for proposing the initial ideas to work from. I encourage the department to consider annual fluctuations due to weather. On a subdivision level, we see annual use fluctuating by 20% up and down based on precipitation and temperature. Just a thought with respect to setting the low.
Okay, and Brett, maybe you can unmute yourself if I don't quite get at your comment here, or if there's anything else you can clarify here. I think what you're saying is maybe we consider those types of fluctuations in setting the minimum kind of boundary on the requirements. And
Exactly.
great, thank you, Brett. I appreciate that. I appreciate that feedback. That's really helpful. That's definitely something we can consider. But also, I do think some of those types of natural weather fluctuations and other types of fluctuations like that might not be reflected in historic averages. I think that's kind of what the flexibility accounts are designed to help buffer against. So that could be a consideration in setting the minimum there, or that could be a consideration in setting kind of the range that is allowable in those flexibility accounts. It could kind of be addressed in either place, I think.
That's exactly what I was getting at. I was looking at the second bullet under minimum, lowest actual GPCD from previous 10 years, and the sort of ear-raising thing to me, or whatever you want to say it was that, you know, if you picked, I don't know, what was the dry year, 2019 or 18 or whatever it was, that if you use that for a low, exactly what you said, that your flexibility, flexing above and below that would just never happen. You wouldn't go below it. So anyway, you're exactly on my point. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate it. Great. Did we have any other questions or comments here?
No other questions or comments. Oops. Sorry, I spoke too soon. Carol has commented here. Of course, water use will increase when it is hotter and drier. This is why it is so important to ensure we have appropriate landscapes that can withstand hot and dry, that we have efficient cooling towers, etc. Ongoing adaptation will be very important to the resiliency of our communities.
Great. Yes, that's an excellent point. Thank you, Carol, for chiming in there. I appreciate that. We know that thinking about the programs in this way can be a little bit difficult. We really did want to just kind of throw out some ideas, kind of our initial thoughts on how this program might look for this initial discussion. So we really appreciate all of your feedback and thought on this. We do have several questions on the questionnaire for this meeting that'll allow a little bit more space for feedback on these GPCD requirements, on components, on these types of things. So we definitely hope you will continue to think about this. And certainly you're all welcome to chime in throughout the rest of this meeting with any additional thoughts or ideas that you might have. We are very much looking for specific feedback here on what are the timeframes we should use? What are the ways in which we should think about establishing these requirements? At some point, we're going to have to put some kind of a formula down on paper. So the more feedback we can get that's specific about how we might do that, the more feedback we can get on that would be really helpful. Maggie, I think I'm seeing some more comments coming in.
Yes. A couple more comments here. One from Patrick. He's commented, one of the challenges in setting a non-residential GPCD target is that overnight, a water provider could fall out of compliance if a single water user were to come into the service area. As was stated earlier, this would penalize economically valuable water use, even if it was very efficient.
Okay. I see your point there, Patrick. And I think maybe there's a couple different ways we could go about addressing that. I'm very much just kind of spitballing here. So perhaps there could be a mechanism by which a provider could indicate that they had a significant new water use where they didn't think they would be able to meet their GPCD, where they think it would push them out of compliance with their Flex account, perhaps there could be a reevaluation request available for providers in order to address that type of thing. I think we'd have to do some thinking about how exactly a mechanism like that might work, but in terms of the fifth management plans, there is opportunity to build those types of considerations and flexibility type provisions in. So maybe to all of you and to Patrick, maybe as you're thinking through how we build this for the fifth management plans, that might be a piece of feedback that is helpful. Is okay, I understand what you're saying as a challenge, that component is a challenging thing because it's not necessarily reflective of population. So how do we address that in building this program? How can we address that with the policy? I think that would be an important piece of feedback and brainstorming to have out of this process.
Thank you, Natalie. Patrick did clarify here that he was referring to single high volume water user, which I think that you gathered that. Heather agrees. Jake Lender King agrees with Patrick. I have an additional question here from Melinda. She's commented, does the inability to reach the GPCD goal for some affect their redesignation?
So I do not believe that would have any impact on the redesignation. There may be some consideration in the redesignation process of whether they are meeting, a given provider is meeting the management plan requirements, but they would just need to be meeting the management plan requirements for the program that they are in. So if a given provider cannot reach their GPCD goal for any given reason, sorry about that. If they can't reach their GPCD goal, they would still have the option of requesting to be moved into the non-per capita program. So there are still alternatives available to the GPCD program. Hopefully that answered your question, Melinda.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm not seeing any questions or comments. Oh, I spoke too soon. Adria has commented, can we revisit Heather's comment of having a BMP-based non-residential program and a GPCD-based residential program?
So, sure, yes. I think that's worth having a discussion about. I guess my question back to Adria, to Heather, might be whether this is something that is still under the kind of basic GPCD program, or whether something like that might be developed as an alternative conservation program. It is actually very similar to our existing alternative conservation program. So perhaps that's a conversation that we should have of whether splitting the existing GPCD program like that is most appropriate, or whether that fits better under updates to the existing alternative conservation program. So I'm certainly open to additional comments or consideration of that. I see a request from Heather to unmute and speak. Go ahead, Heather.
I've unmuted you, Heather.
Thank you. Natalie, I think the idea of having the kind of modified GPCD program that includes BMP for non-res is one of the only ways that we've so far imagined that could make the GPCD program contemplate efficient water use over total water use, which I think is a better goal. It feels like the conversation is trying really, really hard to work uphill to make GPCD as a whole work just because it's part of a regulatory requirement. And so, I mean, I think we need to consider how much room do we have to deviate from this regulatory requirement in order to make the GPCD program or the GPCD substitute something that is practical and logical, as opposed to just doing it for the sake of meeting the regulatory statute.
Sure, and maybe that is a point where I would at least partially disagree with you, Heather. I think focusing on total water use is also a really important thing here in the context of reducing withdrawals of groundwater, in the context of meeting the goals of both the management plans and of the AMAs. We recognize that a reduction, that conservation kind of needs to include a reduction in total water use in order to move toward safe yield or the other goals of the other AMAs. I think efficiency can be an important aspect of moving toward those goals and reducing total water use. But we have to recognize that in order to move toward the goals of the AMAs, we do need to consider how we reduce our total water use and reduce overdraft. So yes, incentivizing these types of efficiency things can be important, but I think in the context of the total GPCD program, there's a real mechanism for reducing total demand as well. So maybe it's kind of a little bit of a both answer where I definitely see your point, but I think focusing on total demand is also a really important piece of that. And feel free to unmute yourself again if you want to respond to that, or if I missed the point there.
I appreciate your feedback, Natalie, and I see the value in reducing the total water demand. I just think that that's a hard way to regulate the providers. And if the providers are trending to be more efficient because of the policies that they're implementing, then it wouldn't be unreasonable, I think, to expect total water use per capita and per economic development to go down over time.
Okay. I appreciate that clarification, Heather. And again, as I've mentioned, these are difficult issues to wade through. I think there is certainly a lot of nuance to be had here. We are, by statute, working. These conservation programs are required to be designed to achieve reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. That is kind of our ultimate goal here. But we also want to make sure that we are building things that are realistic and building things that are really going to move the AMAs toward their goals as a whole, and also be really functional for those water users that need to use them. I appreciate your point about those different developments and everything kind of moving in that right direction. That's exactly what we're kind of going for, is moving in that correct direction, moving toward reductions in withdrawals of groundwater, using efficiencies to better manage our total demands. So I think where that leads me, though, is that perhaps both types of programs are valuable, where perhaps some providers would be better served by a total GPCD program. Other providers might be better served by a residential GPCD program plus non-residential BMPs. Am I I'm certainly open to feedback on that. I'm just trying to kind of reflect back what I'm hearing today. And that's certainly something that you all can provide additional feedback on either in the chat box or through the questionnaire. Maggie, I just want to make sure we're not missing anything in the chat box here. I think we've got a few things coming in.
Several people here are agreeing with Heather, but I'm going to back up a little bit here and go back to Terry Sue's question. She's commented, will entry into the total GPCD program still include being a designated provider?
Yes, so that is that particular requirement is in statute, that the GPCD program is the default for designated providers, and that undesignated providers shall be in the non per capita program. So yes, that is not something. Undesignated providers would still be limited to being in the non per capita program because of that statute.
Thank you, Natalie. Comment here from Adria. She's commented the only way to reduce total demand is to target areas that are overusing or not putting water to beneficial use, which boils down to inefficiencies. And Heather has commented that Adria's point reflects what she was trying to articulate. Chris Connor agrees with Adria's point about targeting inefficiencies.
Okay, thank you, Adria. I appreciate that point. And perhaps that type of specific targeting is not necessarily something we would want to build into a broader program like a GPCD program. I think that might be more fitting for the non per capita program, but maybe someone can correct me if I'm kind of missing the mark there. I think the idea of the GPCD program is it's closer to an allotment type program, right? Where you just have a cap and you figure out there's flexibility within your within the provider, within the entity to figure out how to get to that cap. Where the non per capita program is a little more prescriptive, although there's a list of options, it's a little more prescriptive in how you get to those conservation targets. Maybe I'm missing the mark there, but I think I agree with what you're saying and maybe just see it fitting in slightly differently.
Thank you, Natalie. Question here from Craig. He's commented, additionally, is it really a goal to drive down surface water in general or to drive down groundwater use?
Thank you, Craig, for that question. So what we are looking at is that ultimately all of our water uses are linked, right? So when I talk about reducing total demand in order to move toward the goals of the AMAs, that's in recognition that when we reduce total demand, our groundwater use also is reduced. So that concept has been well demonstrated over time. The department uses what we call a stacking method in determining compliance, where if you're using groundwater is the last piece that we look at. So if you reduce your total use, then so we're looking at total use with groundwater being that last piece that we do compliance on. So we are looking at demand management. We are looking at reducing total water use, finding ways to get to conservation in order to meet the goals of the AMAs, because we recognize that all of those water sources are kind of inextricably linked to each other. So that is not to say necessarily that you should reduce your surface water use if you're going to replace that with groundwater. It's really reducing total water use in order to drive down groundwater use, because we know that those things are very closely linked to each other. I know that's kind of a complicated answer to what felt like a simple question, but it's water. Everything's complicated, right? So Thank you, Craig, for that point, though.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm not seeing anything additional in the chat box at this time.
Great, thank you. I really do appreciate all of the comments, the robust discussion today. I do hope that you all will consider a lot of the points that were made in today's discussion, the things on the slide. I really look forward to seeing additional comments in the questionnaire and seeing if there are kind of some concrete directions that we can start going from here. So thank you for all of that.
Thanks, Natalie. Just a comment here from Heather. She's mentioned total water use driving down total groundwater use assumes perfect water resource portfolio management. Just an important thing to keep in mind if groundwater reduction is the key goal.
Fair enough. I appreciate that comment, Heather. Thanks. All right, we will go ahead and move on to the next slide here. As I mentioned earlier, the flexibility account is also something we want to consider in the context of this program. So currently, under the fourth management plan, providers can accumulate up to 60 GPCD of credits or incur negative 20 GPCD of debits before. So if they go lower than negative 20, then they're considered to be out of compliance. So this is also something we are looking for feedback on for the fifth management plans. Maybe to Brett's earlier point, perhaps this is something that might consider climate variability or dry years, or perhaps there is a different way that we might consider establishing these flexibility accounts. We have heard a fair amount of confusion on the existing flex account structure. So perhaps there's some reason that this structure could be simplified. There are other flex accounts that, rather than going with plus a number or minus a number, allow for plus or minus a certain percentage of the requirement or the target. Maybe that's a more straightforward way to go about this. We are certainly open to suggestion here on how we go about this, whether the kind of current range is appropriate, or whether that range needs to be reevaluated, whether that range should be converted to some kind of a percentage. That's certainly something I am open to here, and we are certainly looking for suggestions on how to move forward with the flex account structure. So I'll go ahead and pause here. Maggie, I think I saw a couple comments come in.
Thanks, Natalie. Comment here from Carol. She's mentioned, I think it would be helpful to walk us through stacking at a future meeting and why it is such a foundational, critical concept.
Thank you, Carol. That's a really good point, and that is absolutely something we will include on our next meeting.
Sandra has commented that the current method is very straightforward. A percentage would also make sense.
Great. Thank you, Sandra.
No other questions or comments right now.
Great, thank you. There is space on the questionnaire to provide additional feedback on this. We would really appreciate any thought or feedback you have here. It may seem that this piece is a little less critical than setting the targets, but maybe to Brett's earlier point, because there is variability in the weather from year to year, these types of flex accounts really can become very helpful, very important in terms of providers maintaining compliance over time and having kind of the flexibility they need with their regulatory requirements. So we would certainly appreciate any consideration or thoughts that you all have on this item. So, since I'm not seeing any additional comments, we will go ahead and move on. So that's actually all we had for today. I do really appreciate the engagement that we see in this group. We know that these concepts are tricky and complicated and confusing, and that's why it is so essential that we get the detailed feedback that we very regularly get from you all. So I just want to express my appreciation for the feedback that you all so readily provide, both in these meetings, in the questionnaires, and in our side conversations. I really do appreciate the engagement of this group. It's very helpful. And I think it will ultimately lead to better end products. So I'm very excited about that. So McKenna covered some background and some additional items on the non-per capita program. Please do take a look at that appendix and provide additional feedback on the goodness, I'm sorry, the word is escaping my brain, on the individual BMPs. Provide additional feedback on the individual BMPs. We would really appreciate that feedback. And thank you for those of you who have already provided feedback on those additional BMPs. That's very helpful. We would like to kind of get that wrapped up as much as possible, because we are hoping to, in the early part of next year, start moving into a phase of writing these fifth management plans. So all of this work that we've been doing through these work group meetings is going to start getting put down on paper in the near future, and we're also really looking forward to that. For our next meeting, we will continue talking about some more details of this GPCD program, kind of fleshing out some of the conversation that we've had so far. And it kind of sounds like we might have some space for a discussion of an alternative program, whether how we want to structure the program kind of matches with this idea of non-residential BMPs. I think there's room for discussion of both of those options at this point. So what I would like to do right now is actually give a call out to Terry Sue. Terry Sue Rossi recently gave a presentation to the PANAL AMA GUAC about a program that they are doing. And she had some ideas about a potential alternative program. Well, I'll give a minute to Terry Sue to kind of introduce that idea, but we will dive further into it at a future meeting. Terry Sue, are you still here? Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, yeah.
Perfect. Oh,
okay. All right. I did it down below, and then it gave me a little box. So I'm the Water Resources Manager for Arizona Water Company, and we are embarking on a partnership with the City of Casa Grande to do what I would call an integrated demand management program. So I'm kind of less, I guess, concerned about what conservation program we are in, and more concerned about putting together an effective program and actually reducing water use. And so I've sort of pretended like the programs don't exist and have created something that I think works for our area. And what I think is different about it is we're a private utility. Arizona Water Company is regulated by the Corporation Commission. And we're not a city, obviously, but we operate within cities. And we wanted to be able to take advantage of all the potential ways that you can conserve, including those things that only a city can do. And so we've been working with Casa Grande on an integrated water resource plan. And then we've also been working with them on a demand management program. And so what we've done is we've taken kind of the best of what Casa Grande could do and the best of what we can do and integrated them together. So, for example, we've worked with the city on putting a really solid water element into their general land use plan that, in fact, includes a reduction in residential GPCD by 15%. Actually, that's not residential; that's total GPCD by 15%. And then they've got a number of city codes and ordinances that are consistent with the management plans and trying to make sure that all the management plan requirements are embedded within their codes. We would, as a water provider, we would get no credit for any of that as far as the BMP program is concerned. And so what we'd like to do is be able to create an integrated program that would include all the things that we would be doing as the water provider and all the things that the city would be doing, and almost as if we are their water department. And we actually see ourselves as their water department. And so that's kind of the basic idea. And there's a lot more detail around that, but I thought that might be, we're putting together an issue paper that we would like to present with some more detail of kind of about how that works. And it would also probably have a regulatory component. So how do we have to interface with the Arizona Corporation Commission, how that works as well. So it's something that it's been talked about for 30 years, just this whole issue of private utilities complying with whether it's the total GPCD program or a non-per capita or whatever type of program. So this is a little different way to approach that particular horse, and also leveraging the best of both worlds if you're a city and a private utility. And we're happy to share the idea with you all at a future date.
Great, thank you, Terry Sue. So as I mentioned, we will have a more detailed discussion and presentation on that proposal, that idea, at our next meeting. We are really looking forward to that, and thank you very much, Terry Sue, for bringing that idea forward. I think it's definitely something worth discussing. I think it's a really interesting idea. So our next meeting is on February 10th. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we do have some upcoming meetings coming up. As I said, our next municipal meeting is on February 10th, but ahead of that, we do have a management plans work group meeting on December 16th. Please take a note of that date. That date has been changed from what was previously announced. And we also have an ag meeting on the board for December 8th. Which is a new meeting date. So we are going to be sending out an email in the next day or two, just kind of reiterating those upcoming dates to make sure that everybody has the correct dates on their calendars. But as always, the correct dates are always available on ADWR's public meetings calendar or on our 5MP meetings page on ADWR's website. So please let me know if you have any questions or anything like that, and we'll go to the next slide. I think it's the last one. Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here for just 1 minute just to see if anyone else has any questions. We very much appreciate, as I said before, all of your engagement and participation and willingness to have this dialogue, this back and forth on these various ideas. It's been incredibly helpful for me, for my staff, for the development of these plans. And we very much appreciate you all attending and being here today. So I'll pause for just 1 minute and then we will go ahead and close out if we don't have any questions.
Thanks, Natalie. Just some feedback here from Heather. She's mentioned, I'd like to say thank you to ADWR for hosting these forums for discussions. Lots of thank yous from Chris, Tina, Adria, Sam, Kathy, all the rest.
Great. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. We really appreciate your participation and attendance here today. And we'll go ahead and close out today's meeting. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to hearing all of your thoughts on these ideas going forward. Thank you.